All right. Hello, folks, and welcome to another edition of The Binding Status. My name is Daniel Mangum. I am a maintainer on the Crossplane project and the host of The Binding Status. So this is our 23rd episode, and we have Marques joining us again. Marques works over at Packet, and today we're going to be doing some Packet things, some bootstrapping new providers things, specifically provider-ssh. But Marques always is a great person to join the show when we're going to hack around on something and interact with maybe some bare metal instances spun up on Packet. So I think you already know him, but Marques, is there anything you wanted to mention today? Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks for having me again and again. Uh, no, nothing in particular. So, like the packet provider is probably one of the first like community providers that came about on its own. I've been maintaining it a little bit here and there with you. We've added some resources along the way, and we started with this idea of with Kubernetes, with managed Kubernetes resources, you can throw Helm charts at them. You can throw some sort of applications at them and have those get provisioned, air quotes provisioned. And with bare metal devices, you have something that needs to be SSH'd into to do exciting work. Or you can take advantage of user data. But if you take advantage of user data, you have to figure it out early on. So this conversation just sort of led to let's figure out a way to provision these bare metal resources early. That's why we're here. And you know, these hacking sessions that we have on TBS are a different breed.
Yeah, for sure. So this should be pretty fun. Like Margaret said, this is a bit more of a hacking session rather than some of our more formal shows where we have someone on from a new project or company or something like that. So specifically, if you're interested in contributing to Crossplane or extending Crossplane, today's show will be great for you. And in the coming weeks, we're going to be moving back towards a few more kind of professional shows, if you will, where you can maybe, as an operator of Crossplane, get some insight about how you can interact with other projects. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. And for full context, we're intentionally are kind of going to do this on the fly to show what it looks like to bootstrap something new. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And we can take a look at some of the ideas we had around doing this show and kind of where we're starting from. So what I have open here is a very lean Crossplane provider. So this was generated from, and I'll pull it up here. If we look over at the Crossplane org, we have a provider template repo, which is currently undergoing some refactoring as we make some changes in Crossplane, which will be coming out soon. But essentially, this allows you to create a new provider. So you can just use this template and literally bootstrap a new repo from it. You do have to do some adjusting once you do that. But you can think of, with like Cube Builder and Knit or something like that. It generates the scaffolding. This is similar, but it just goes ahead and does it in a Git repo for you. And then you can just modify it. So if you look at what it brings, it basically starts out with just a sample resource. So if we take a look at it, it's just going to look like a typical CRD, and it just has some dummy fields in here. Like this is a configurable field, this is an observable field, but has the general pattern that you would use with Crossplane. And the other type of resource it's going to have is a provider config. These are also have formerly been just called providers, but we've renamed them to provider config, and that will be present in the next 0.13 Crossplane release. But basically, a provider config just tells you how you want to authenticate to whatever API is backing a provider, right? So Crossplane provider presents new API types into your cluster, which represent external services and reaches out over an API to do that. So typically that's a cloud provider like Packet or AWS or GCP or Azure, anything like that. and those sometimes have different authentication methods. So what you do in your provider config is you generally just have a secret key selector, and then you reference your provider config from any types. So for instance, in our sample type, we'd have a provider config ref, and we would reference that to be able to get our connection information, authenticate to the cloud provider, and then provision our sample thing on that cloud provider. So if you actually look real quick back at the sample resource, you'll see that we have some embedded structs to make this gymnastics a little bit easier for you. So you'll see the my type spec here has resource spec embedded from Crossplane runtime. So I'll actually hop over here where I've already done a bit of modifying. But if we look in types, I go here and then looked over at the, sorry, this is the wrong one, in workload here. If we looked over at the resource spec, you're going to see that it has this provider config reference built in by default. And it also has things like the status observation and other things. And then you can generate your managed resource references here. So it's going to have fields like get provider config reference for convenience when you're writing a controller. All right, so as you can see here, we're in a repo called provider-ssh. That's the name of the show this week. So one other thing I want to point out is that we have a Crossplane contrib org. And you'll see this is where we kind of do some of our more experimental stuff. So if a new person in the community wants to start a project, but it's not clear about what kind of support they're going to be able to give it, or what its viability is, it's more kind of experimental, then we are pretty loose about putting things in this Crossplane contrib org and just letting people hack on them. Some of them are a bit more official. So you'll see Provider Helm here is trending towards joining the main Crossplane org, as it's coming along really nicely and has had a lot of activity. And we'll be showing some usage of that in future episodes. Today, we're going to work on provider-ssh, which is just a repo I created. And you'll see I've only got the stuff locally right now. So it's empty. But as I was talking about, you generally have, a cloud provider or some type of API that's backing your provider. In this case, with provider-ssh, it's kind of similar to Provider Helm, where it's not your traditional, public API. SSH is our API behind it. So we're going to use SSH keys to be able to connect to a instance that we've spun up. Whether it's a virtual machine or bare metal or something like that. And all we need to be able to do is point at a secret that has the information we need to connect via SSH. The other thing to kind of like wrap your mind around this, Provider Helm, for instance, is using the actual Kubernetes API as its way to authenticate, right? So you could use Provider Helm in cluster to say, create this chart resource, and it will create the chart in your cluster or install the chart in your cluster. Or it could be from a cluster, you pass other authentication information, and it provisions a Helm chart in a remote cluster that you've given it a kube config for. So really anything that has an API, you can create a provider for. And we're going to look at some of the ways that can be beneficial. Specifically, Packet's kind of main value play, I guess, and Marques, you can correct me if this is wrong, but is kind of providing bare metal instances. And one of the ways that folks typically interact with those instances they provision is via SSH. There is similar to how, let me move this window here somewhere else.
I'm still waiting for the pizza provider.
Well, we do have a Slack provider that lets you post Slack messages. So that one's fun. But let me go ahead and show. Well, actually, let's go to the documentation website and look at the Packet API types. So Crossplane provider Packet. It's over in the Packet host org. And in the device type here, I believe there's a user data section. So this is typically what you get with, any type of instance that you're going to provision on a cloud provider. You can pass it some user data, which, maybe some type of script to do some setup or that sort of thing. But we were noticing that there's some situations where you want to go outside of that, or you might want to do something, well after provisioning is complete, or do something, get the return value back, and then take action based on that. So that's really the motivation for creating provider SSH here. And it's similar to with Terraform or something like that. You can pass your user data to like an EC2 instance or something, but they also have the SSH provisioner for things to go outside of that. So the first kind of resource idea we have for that is creating a script resource, which is basically just authenticate via SSH, run this script, and tell me what happens. But you can imagine there could be almost like a cron SSH sort of job or something like that. There's lots of different possibilities for what we could do here. But today we're just going to try and kind of get this set up with the things that we need, and see if we can actually execute something on the remote machine. So, Marcus, I know you were taking a look at spinning up an instance. Is that already ready?
It's ready. Ding. So there you go.
Nice.
So what you saw there in that CRD for packet was that there was a user data field, and then there was also a user SSH key and a project SSH key slice of strings or arrays. And those are actually IDs to SSH keys that have to be stored in the packet, in packets backend in the API. Mm-hmm. And so the other half of this work, which maybe we'll get to, maybe we won't, but I'm working on it right now. Started a little bit before this, but what we would need is for the packet provider to have an SSH key resource so that you could maybe this is one of the things that we were just talking about a little bit ago, is like, whose responsibility is it to provide an SSH key? If you just apply any public key into your SSH or into your Kubernetes cluster as a resource, that's not enough. You can't just do it with a public key. The private key needs to be stored inside of your cluster. So in order for a provisioner to work. So are you going to create that SSH key locally and then copy and paste both the private key and the public key into a Kubernetes resource? That sounds like we're not doing our jobs if that's what we expect. Should the packet provider, when you're using this project SSH key resource, should it generate a key for you? Perhaps. And then what does it do with that key? Does it stash it in a secret? Probably. But the last thing that we were talking about just a little bit ago was maybe it's the responsibility of this provider to generate SSH keys and stash them away in a secret. That means that there's one central way to create SSH keys in your Kubernetes cluster for the provisioner, and then all of the providers like Packet that want an SSH key can reference that SSH key resource as a secret and deposit into their APIs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was a really good summary, and I tried to write down those points here generally. So, the first thing is the provider config. We want it to be able to point it at a secret and then reference it from other resource types we create. And that would be used, right, if it was kind of that case that you're talking about where you went ahead and created a secret, where you've manually created your SSH key and you're just putting that into Kubernetes. And then the other case that you're talking about, which this would be a little bit different from other managed resources we have in Crossplane, because we're not authenticating to something, right? This is like in cluster functionality. We're creating this SSH key. But you can imagine the workflow here. And I'm especially thinking about this with composition in Crossplane, where you can kind of like abstract away multiple resources. Imagine that you have, a composition that has a, let's see, whatever we want to call create the private key resource. Let's just call it key. So it has a key resource, and what this does is it's going to generate SSH key and store in secret. And then let's say you have a after it does that, it can report status too, right? So this should be a fairly quick operation, right? We're not having to reach out to an external API. So let's say
couldn't get enough random bits, failed.
Yeah. Right. So it should be successful usually, unless if you have an issue with your cluster. So generate the SSH key, store it in a secret. Next thing we'd want to do is maybe have a packet machine, or we call it device, right? That So we have the device, which is a packet resource, and that is probably going to have a cross-resource reference to key, right? And so it's going to say once that key is ready, I'm going to provision this machine and add this key to it, right? Add the public key. And then third, we might want something like the script resource. So let me go ahead and note that this would be SSH, or let's see, provider SSH. This would be from provider packet. And this last one would be script. Once again, this is going to, well, one of the things that's interesting here is the device that we've kind of got mixed information here, right? Because the key is going to generate an SSH key that you would store in the secret, and then the device is going to have an IP, right, which is going to be allocated when you provision, right? Well, can you do deterministic IPs? Like, could you reserve IPs ahead of time?
You can, yeah.
Okay.
The device. So what else? Yeah, I see what you mean. There's like a little loop here. So if
Right.
the key creates a secret that has the key in it, and the script maybe doesn't take. Do you have you haven't represented the idea of like the packet SSH key here? I think
Right.
maybe it's like 2B or
Yeah, you mean
something.
like what gets spit out from like packet or adding the public key to the device?
Adding so there's packet projects can have multiple SSH keys registered with them. So the resource that I was starting here was a packet SSH key resource, which
Mm-hmm.
maps some some public key as a string to an entity inside of a project. And
Mm-hmm.
then any devices inside of that project will be pre-provisioned with those keys.
Okay.
Uh, so if we could have like a 2B here that represents like SSH key.
Right. So I wonder if that's what the provider config for provider SSH would actually point at, or is it going to still
Provider.
need to point at? Let's see. So let's call it SSH key, and you're saying in this that we want this to map the public key to what in packet?
To packet API, and this would be part of provider packet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
It actually puts it inside of a packet project.
Okay. So what do we need that for though, right? When it Oh wait, you're saying that you add the SSH keys. So this would be before actually provisioning the device, right?
Right. Yeah.
So you add the SSH key to the project, and that has to already be present when you provision the device. Is
Yeah.
that right?
And
Or when you add the
when you
SSH key
provision the
after?
device by default, it'll use all of the keys available in that project, but you can be selective with it if you want,
Gotcha. So
which there's already. Yeah.
you can't add a new key when you're like provisioning a device, like during the process of it. It has to already be present in your.
Right. Yeah.
Gotcha.
I was when you loaded up the CRD, it flashed to me that what
Yeah.
it takes there is an ID of a key, not the actual public key.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Cool. So it seems like we generate the key and then maybe point this SSH key thing at the key that we've generated, and then the device would have a reference to SSH key. So this is going to actually public key to packet project. So public key, it's going to from key above, and that's going to put it in your packet project. And then the device is going to have a cross ref to the SSH key, which is going to say, please pull the ID off of this and provision my device with this ID for this key that already exists in my project on packet. And then our provider config, this is where it's a little tricky. It needs the IP from the device, and it needs the key information from the provider SSH key, right? Um,
As much as
so
possible, I think it'd be great if that wasn't bound to any particular resource, if it could fetch the strings arbitrarily from anything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, so a secret is a nice generic thing to like standardize on. But what I'm thinking here is it may actually be beneficial to have um, SSH, this point to the key, always point to the key, and then the IP be something like on the script. Do you think that makes sense?
Okay, so the provider config for this SSH will, yeah, that makes sense. So
Yeah. The
the
one
SSH
issue,
provider needs to know what key it's going to be using, and then each script has to pick which IP it's going to. I wonder
yeah.
if we get into more advanced use cases, if it's like, well, I have a key and I have a list of IPs. I want you to run it on all of them. More like an
Yeah.
Ansible playbook kind of a thing.
Yeah. Well, let's not get carried away, but the the well, what I'm thinking is like a key is not specifically tied to an IP address, right? So it feels a little weird um for the provider
Right.
config to be restricted to that. Just like for instance, we just changed provider AWS to not have the region in the provider config because it's not actually, your authentication is not actually tied to a region. It can have a default region, but you can use it across regions. So it's a little weird where people would have like a provider for US West 2, but be provisioning things in US East 1. So anyway, all right.
I ran into the
Uh,
same thing with packet projects that the packet project ID is part of the provider config, but well, the old school provider config, I don't know what to call that. Uh,
uh-huh.
but one of the things that I want you to be able to do with the packet provider is create new projects in Crossplane. And if there's already a context of a provider or of a project ID, it's a little weird that you're creating new projects with that.
Right.
So there's other abstractions. So there's like an organization ID is maybe a higher level thing that could be tied to the provider. But then that means on every kind of resource you create, you're going to need to take a project ID reference or string. So it's a matter of how much how convenient do you want to make things versus how API accurate do you want to make things.
Yeah, yeah, and we were talking about this before. We generally try and be as high fidelity with the API as possible, even in like cases where it feels like it's a little inconvenient. The reason for that, right, is if someone's interacting with the API directly, they're going to get the same experience. That's one part of it, which that part can kind of be disputed because you can say like, well, what if they're interacting with the console and they're used to a different workflow? But the thing that's really important is that as long as you don't diverge from the cloud provider or the API's, high fidelity representation, then you can just point people to that documentation, right? When they experience errors and when we return those errors back to them. So that's a really important thing where we don't want to, provide abstraction in front of the error messages and the endpoints and that sort of thing, or else then we're, maintaining our whole separate set of documentation and trying to map that to their API endpoints. And so we generally default to using composition to create abstractions on top of that so you can define them yourselves rather than us being opinionated about them. All right, so I think we've got a pretty good setup here. So we should probably get into it because we're already about halfway through the show. But I think what we're going to start off with here is we obviously need this provider config, and we also need we don't need the key yet because we're just going to do that manually today, and we don't need this or this really, even though we have it, because we already have provisioned that device with a key, and Marques has shared that SSH key with me so generously. So what we really need to create here, because we already have our provider config that came with the template, we really need to create this script resource, right? And it's going to need this IP field and then also, like script contents, I guess, which we can just make a string. So we're putting this in a workload group, which, I don't know if that's a great name for it, but that's what we're doing for
Words are
today.
hard. Names are
Yeah,
harder.
right. All right, so let's go ahead. This my type is just like what we called the initial thing. I could, do a find and replace. That would be cool. All right. So let's go ahead and make that. It's going to make everything upset at us. Okay, so we have this script type here, and these are probably all these. We don't want any of these. All
I
right.
was doing some of this copy pasting from in the packet provider trying to make my new SSH resource based on the last one that we added. And copy and paste, change the name, did 99% of the work, to the
Mhm.
point where, it really made me wonder if a generator could have done that.
Right. Yeah, I know. That's a thing. Like, I wonder. Obviously, like a good way to do this is with like a CLI. Like I mentioned, Cube Builder earlier. And you can pass arguments to that to parameterize the things that it spits out. Of course. I'd like to be able to do that. I don't know. I mean, like GitHub does a lot of amazing things. It seems like with these template repositories, you should be able to like create from template with parameters. I
Oh
think that would be
yeah.
super
Oh,
cool.
that's
Maybe
great.
maybe I should give them a little nudge on that on Twitter or something. But that would be really
Yeah.
cool.
Tweet Nate.
Yeah. Or I wonder if you just had like a repo that wasn't specifically a template, or was, if you could use like some sort of GitHub action to do that. But I'm not sure. I know GitHub. You were telling me GitHub actions are magical, so we
Yeah.
really do need to pay
You can have
attention
it
to that.
work on fork too. So like, let's say somebody forks your template repo, you can create a pull request that like, based on the name of their repo, maybe make some substitutions. There's not enough parameters really to fill in the blanks there.
Right. All right. So I'm just gonna go ahead and bolt do this. That probably broke a lot of things. Um, let's see. Provider-ssh workload. That should actually work. And I want to fix all of these, which this comes with like a very bare bones makefile. If you've ever looked at a lot of the Crossplane providers, we have a build submodule, which has a lot of great functionality for interacting with Jenkins and promoting things and that sort of thing. But it is nice if you're just getting started to just kind of use this more basic thing that's just calling commands directly. It's obviously not as robust, but it can be useful. So let's go ahead and regenerate all of those helpful methods. This might fail actually, um, but it's just running go generate for us, which will already be all set up. Yeah, so undeclared name my type. It's going to get mad at us. Well, we'll make these go away then and let you create them again. Yeah, so that's one of the nice things is there's just a lot of tooling already built in. So a lot of the convenience around actually making these Kubernetes API types is fairly straightforward. All right, so we have our script type here. And let's see, what should we say let's just call this, you want to just say success for now? Like if it executed with exit 0?
That sounds reasonable. Is it? So the observation is only going to. Yeah, that's one of the things that's interesting about like an SSH provisioner is does it reconcile once or does it reconcile always?
Yeah. Okay. So
And
I was having a
yeah,
conversation with Nick about this because he just saw the repo pop up. For anyone who's not aware, Nick is the like tech lead on Crossplane, and
he's also, I need to interrupt you. He's
okay.
also the brilliant designer of the name of that generator. So this project is Crossplane, and the generator is Angry Jet, which is angry and cross and plane and jet. That's amazing.
It is amazing.
That's all I got on Nick.
Well, anyway, he saw that repo pop up, and like his first reaction was, well, that's not a declarative thing. Like that sounds like an imperative thing that you do run a script, right? This doesn't really make sense for Kubernetes, which I think is an appropriate reaction for sure. Um, uh, but I also gave the example of like a Kubernetes job isn't that kind of doing the same thing potentially, like it's running once to completion, and managing that. So, with this kind of like bootstrap thing, I think I might have pointed this out earlier already, but Terraform also has these like provisioners, and if you read their documentation, they'll highly advise you to use something like user data when possible, right? And I think that would be something we would stick to here as well, because you're more like conforming with API, right? It's just less moving pieces. But I think there are really some examples for this, and I think something that runs on a schedule could be an example of that. Or something that requires the device to get provisioned and then something else to happen and then to run a script, like something that gates on other actions taking place, where obviously the user data isn't going to work there. So I think we may have some cool things to do with that, with some packet things coming up. but we won't
And
get too
what
into
I'd
that.
really like to see is, so you mentioned Terraform first, so now I feel I can mention it. But there's there are
We like
Terraform
Terraform for some use cases.
modules that there's a lot of them for Packet already that do interesting things like provision anthos for you, provision Tanzu, and provision you name it. Um, and 99% of that is SSH work. So to be able to port something like that to Crossplane, we really need an SSH provisioner.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And also, like if you're gonna mix Crossplane in VM in any kind of VM heavy service provider, you're going to need SSH support, I think, at some point.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. The
Looking at
another
you,
thing
DigitalOceans and Linodes and GCPs.
another thing that is of note there is I wonder if some of those things that are used via SSH right now, well, obviously for packet, if you're doing on like bare metal, this isn't going to work. But in some cases, and like if you're provisioning something on a Kubernetes cluster, then you might be able to use like Helm or something like that, which is kind of like a provisioner as well, at least comparable to what we're doing here. Um, all right, so I'm just going to do this really quick. So we need to set up the config, which is going to be based off this secret that we get off the provider config. The other thing that we're going to need to actually dial the connection, which is a little weird because we're going to pass this as a client to it. All right, let's
And we were
say,
looking at this client, and it was very not obvious how this is taking advantage of the private key.
yeah, it was kind of strange. So we're gonna have to look in the documentation for this a little bit. Let's see. I want to get the spec and the I for provider IP. Um, let's see. Let's just make this sprint f, and we'll just do %s.
And what this could also be the template for future provisioners. Like maybe you make a salt one, maybe you make
Mm-hmm.
a puppet one where they can continually reconcile. They are declarative, and and they'll also need SSH, perhaps. Maybe not. I think
Right.
Salt can talk directly to the Salt server and pass things around, but
Yeah, I
there,
agree.
there's ways to make this declarative.
I think that I don't know. There's kind of a like you want to enable those things, but also I think most of the people using Crossplane are moving towards a more like Kubernetes native approach, right? So it's like we need to support those, but also at the same time, like we maybe we should like encourage not using them, if that makes sense. But I mean, it's unrealistic to think that you wouldn't you wouldn't need those things, especially in enterprise settings. All right. So one thing I'm noticing here is we can likely, for everything we do, if we have other types, really abstract away all of this client configuration, right? Because they're all going to authenticate kind of the same way. But we're just doing one thing today, so that's fine. But for those who aren't familiar, basically we're just using the Crossplane runtime manage reconciler, which basically lets you pass in these things that do things for you automatically. We actually don't need I don't think we're not going to need this new service function. This is generally used to generate a client. We don't really need that because we're always using the SSH client here. And let's see, we don't need this no op service either. All right. And here, let's just say if error does not equal nil, return errors dot wrap, and we'll say error and error get client. What was it? Error new client. All right. So now let's look in how we need to configure this. So I've copied some stuff over, but we're looking at some links as well. And to be honest, I'm not super familiar with the SSH package in Go. So look, this looks like it is using password authentication, which we don't want to do here, but we just need to get the config set up. So let's go ahead and Golang SSH. That's where we were looking before. Private key auth. Let's see.
I can hand you a password if you need one.
Well, I think we want to not use it. Wonder what this is. This looks interesting. I like
when I was originally when I was initially like thinking of how you would do this, I was thinking you'd end up with a machine that's been provisioned, and without having a Crossplane SSH provisioner, you would. Let me rewind a little bit. If I had a packet project SSH key resource, managed resource, and it was generating an SSH key, putting it into my packet project, and then I could provision devices using that key, then I wouldn't necessarily need a Crossplane provisioner. I would need something that could SSH into the machine, use that key, and execute work. Without having the project SSH key resource, I could maybe try to do it today, because the result of creating a packet device currently returns the root password. So could I just use the root password and the IP address to do provisioner work from a separate Docker container? And I found that it was not directly easy or obvious to do that, because the SSH command, when run from a container, is expecting to have like a secure terminal, and I think you might have to use expect or something to hand the password to the SSH command in time for it to run if you're running it from a container. Using Go, though, is a much simpler way, because here we can just supply a password argument. We don't have to worry about configuring the terminal for a container. It would just work. But we would need a Go binary. And in this case, our Go binary is going to be Crossplane. Crossplane provider SSH.
Right. All right. So we need the user also. Trying to think where the user, should we just put that also in the secret?
It should be the mount point of the key. So where some environment variable that says where the key needs to live. Is the config maps, or the secret's going to have the key, and it's going to mount the key to this.
I mean, we're just going to get it from so like we're not going to mount the key on the pod or anything like that.
So it just wants a file
system. Yeah. So it's like, well, first I'm thinking of the user. Should we put that on as a spec field on the script, or?
Oh yeah, on the script or on the
provider config.
Yeah. The same key could be different users depending on which machine it is. Yeah, because I'm Marques on some things, I'm Displayed on other things, but I'll have the same SSH key. So I think it makes sense for the script to want the user.
Nice. I think that's fair as well. All right. Let me get the first field. User string. For some reason, I have like some mental block whenever I'm typing JSON tags. I like can't remember the backtick syntax. Like every time, if there's not another one there, I have to literally go look at another file.
It's the omit empty being inside the quotes is it's unnatural.
Right. All right. Spec and what do we say? User.
I think what helps is if we had more examples of using it with some of the other tags. So instead of using JSON, if you had JSON there and you also had YAML there and you had, I can't think of the other ones, but I know there are some other good ones. If we saw more examples of using other than JSON, it might be more obvious.
All right.
Is there like a new from string instead of a new that takes file?
For the host key callback?
Oh, that's for known host. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
we're just going to ignore hosts. We don't have a known host list here. Or, well, maybe that becomes an option in the future, but we don't need that for stage one.
right. Although, does it say client configuration must supply this callback for the connection to succeed?
And it's just a callback that can just return true all the time, maybe.
Yeah, maybe so. Let me see what's actually happening in this known host here. Um,
Known queue,
file.
string.
Let's see. It recurrent. What is the host key? I want to look at the actual host key callback. Is this an interface? It's a func that returns host name
Okay, so we could just
to
make it
just
something that
return
never
nil.
returns. Yeah, just returns nil and doesn't care about its 3 parameters.
Yeah. All right. So we should. It seems like we should probably just try this in like a separate file before we even try and run it.
Oh,
Let's
wouldn't we
see.
get that as default if this function's nil or not defined? No, I guess not. It would be nil. Never mind.
It would not return. It would not be a function that returns nil, right? It would be a nil function. All right. Error and just return nil. Public key. Oh, that's in the KH thing. SSH. What was the? So that's going to be KH public key. I'm not 100% sold this works, but maybe.
Did you find what that net package was? I'm trying to load this
I
up.
assume that's just go. Yeah, it's just going to get that automatically for me.
Okay.
It's not declared. Oh, I bet it's SSH.public key. That would make more sense. Yeah. Nice. All right. Okay, what else? So we have the user. We're going to get that private key from the ID RSA field there. Dial config. All right. So what I was thinking is, do we just want to try this without the whole secret and just make sure that, like, verify that we have this all set up okay before we actually give it a shot?
Without the secret, meaning you want to just tell this thing to use a password?
No, I mean, like, just here, I'll just show you. Let's just call this test and just have a main dot go in there.
Oh, yeah, sure. Just try the basic code.
I'm going to write a language called OG. So whenever anyone does that, they can. All right, let me just go ahead and get this set up. Package main, func main. All right. And basically what we need is this, but the key is going to be here. Let's see if it gets all that stuff for us. User, we're going to need to pass in. We'll just say log.fatal. Key is, we're going to pass. We're going to need to get a file. All right.
If you download the file into this directory, what I sent you is called TBS-key.
Nice. And if error, do that again. All right. So parse private key, we want, what is this, the bytes? Yeah. So we'll get that from there. User, what is the user? Just user in this case. You sent me the IP as well, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
that is fine to show. All right. Put that there. Client, log.fade off. That's nil again. Or not nil, rather. Client dot, what can I do with this? I think I need to create a new session. I'm actually just going to pull up that thing we were looking at and just use whatever they did. Client.new session, run command. Nice. Let's just give this a shot here. We might need a sequel to this episode. What command do you want to run, Marcus?
Hello world seems appropriate with an echo. You don't need to quote it either.
Good call. I do need to quote.
Space is okay. It won't yell at you for that. Use proper grammar. Just don't put an exclamation point. That'll mess it up.
Cool.
Period's okay.
All right. So what I need to do here is get this TBS key, though. I just want to make sure that this return signer from a PIM encoded private key. Okay, that should be fine. It will return passphrase. Right.
Does user need to be root right there?
It probably doesn't need to be nothing. All right, I'm going to download this TBS key and magically make it appear in this directory here in just a second. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Yeah, all too often I get caught in this trap too of like, well, let's make this provider work, and then never testing the underlying principle of the thing, which is does this SSH client even work?
Right.
We're trying to use the key to connect.
Yeah. Right. We're trying to minimize the dev loop here, which, you know, once you have it set up well for a provider, then it's not as big a deal, right? Because you can kind of you already have your kind of like workflow set up, so you can just, you know, make whatever your workflow is, which is definitely super nice. But we don't necessarily have that all set up here. Sorry, I'm lost in my other command line over here. It's because I'm in the wrong directory.
Speaking of dev environments, Jason, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Is it Tetebris?
I'm not sure exactly, but I know exactly who you're talking about.
He's been working on the Tinkerbell project, which stems from Packet's internal host provisioning system. And so Tinkerbell is the open source version of that, tinkerbell.org. It's what we use.
Everyone watched our last episode and already knows that, Marcus.
I think they do. My 10,000 followers, whose first name starts with the letter Q, you know. But he's using Tilt now to provision Tinkerbell, and so within a local kind cluster, he's got Tilt creating this dev environment where he can use the libvirt to represent the bare metal machines that are being provisioned by Tinkerbell. Mm-hmm. So shout out to Tilt.
Yeah, I've heard Tilt is amazing. We need to get it set up with all the Crossplane providers to shorten that workflow. Yeah, I've heard it's really, really good. The founder of Tilt was he on the SourceGraph podcast? I listened to him on a podcast very recently, and he was really insightful. I think he was the first person to work on the like internal tools team at Google or something like that, which is obviously like kind of infamous now. Let's see here what happens with Hello World. That looks pretty good, I would say.
Are we sure we didn't run that locally? I can't believe how quickly that worked.
Yeah, that was really quick, but
it's bare metal. You know, bare metal is really fast.
Right. It eliminates all of the network latency between your local machine and
No, well, yeah,
it's really magical.
honestly though, I mean, I did a lot of VM work in the past, and you notice it when you're typing into a bare metal machine.
Uh-huh.
There's none of that context overhead. You're not sharing.
All right. This looks like it's working to me, which is exciting.
Yeah.
All right. So what I need to do though is create a secret, and we have 7 minutes left. Unfortunately, well, I don't know about you, Marcus, but I have a hard cutoff today, which is um, sad. But
And
because
just
usually
make
I
me
drag this
host.
out for
Just
forever.
kidding.
Marcus is I'll just give you remote access to my computer too. All right. So what I would really like to do though is to get this running. Um, and with a secret in our Kubernetes cluster with the SSH key and just do what we just did, right? Print who am I? I think that'd be a good goal for the next 7 minutes here. All right. So I'm just going to say always return resource up to date. So let's just do it all in the connect method because that's going to get run each time anyway. The first thing I need to do though is get that the contents of that secret or that private key into my into a secret, right? So first, while we're here, I'll go ahead and kind create cluster. Shout out to kind. And I'm not sure. Let's see. I know you can do from file, right, when creating a secret, but can you do in kube control create secret from file? Can you specify the name you want for it, or I think it
Yeah. The create takes a parameter, which is the name, and the from file is just the data contents. Do you mean, oh, you want like
nice.
the index thing? Yeah, there's with the colons, you can do like name colon. I don't know how to tell it a file instead of a value in that syntax, but I think you can. You can do name, you can do files or strings for each named field.
Gotcha. So yeah, it looks like from file equals and then the actual and then equals again the actual file path. I just literally in the kube control create secret documentation, it has a SSH key example. So let's see. So create generic SSH key secret. So if I change SSH private key, is that the um is that going to be the name of the field in there?
Looks
So if
like
I
it.
make this ID RSA, is that going to do it for me? I'm not sure. And I
Is that
think
what you
it's
call?
actually
I missed that part where we called it IDRSA. It's going to be folks are going to say, why are you using RSA instead of I don't know
that's
elliptical
fine.
something something?
Let's just call it key. How about that? I don't know
Okay.
where I got IDRSA from. All right. SSH key secret. That's fine. Secret generic. Okay. I'm actually going to also go here and make sure that that secret looks good. Get secrets. Mm-hmm. Okay, it looks good to me.
In future versions of it, probably the name that they used in their command line is the best name to use because key could be a public key or private key.
That's a good point. All right, I'm coming back here. I promise. All right. 3 minutes. Can we do it?
We always finish these things like the last 2 minutes.
I know. Okay, so all of these should just be no ops here, which should be fine. What we need to do is make sure to let's make generate, and then we need to install our CRDs. I don't remember if we did. Well, here I'll go ahead and be creating these in examples. So we need our provider config. We don't need this. We already have this. That's not what I want. Thank you. Okay, ssh.crossplane.io. That looks good. Provider config. We'll just call this. The example's fine. I don't know why I was modifying that. We're in default. What did I call the secret? SSH key secret. It's a very apt name for it. Key was key. Awesome. And then our workload, well, I guess it should be script, whatever. Example, what did we run it with? Oh, wait, we can decide that. So for provider, configurable field, provider ref is example. That sounds good. Once again, these are all cluster scoped objects for anyone following along at home. We had let's do user was root, IP was this. I'm not sure if I need to quote that. Yes, I think the YAML gods will frown on me if I do not. And script. Who am I? All right. And these should all be in our config CRD directory. Nice. Okay. I have not looked at the one thing we definitely need to take a look at here is what we're actually doing in here. Zap logger, APIs add to scheme. That's fine. We'll fix that later. This all looks pretty fine to me.
And like this final minute, whether or not this works, I think this is like a big improvement over like the first few providers and that hacking that you had to do with that. So in this one, you just started with the template project, did a few search replaces, dropped in API code. The API is the Golang SSH package, and you've got a new provider.
Yeah, I totally agree. And hopefully we can continue to make that even easier. All right, so we are right at time here, and I'm going to give it a try. Marcus, I want you to tell me what you think the probability that this works is.
65%.
That is super optimistic.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I feel like that's a vote of confidence in me. No matches for kind provider config, so that could be an issue. Let's see. Template. All right, hold on one second. Also, I'm going off my schedule, Marcus. If you need to drop, that's obviously absolutely fine. Crossplane.io. Doc. Yeah, this is, as Marcus was mentioning earlier, this is definitely a reason why we'd like to parameterize this, because you just run into super annoying little things like this. If not, all right, and I need to generate those again. And oops. And what did we do with the debug flag? Okay, provider configs. Okay, this looks better to me. Okay, that happened. We shouldn't see any reconciliation there. All right, and now all right, panic. I am guessing this is too big. Invalid memory address or no pointer dereference. So 77, and I'm really not adhering to my thing. We're going to try this once. Get namespace name provider config reference dot name. This would be because of that. So let me just apply that again and restart the controller. Oh, it's just printing it. External resources up to date. So it's reconciling it successfully, but I can't see anything that's happening there. One sec. Let me.
What was all that? Was that ASCII?
Printing.
As integers?
It's these lines.
Okay.
Yeah, that was not the key. In case you're
Oh,
wondering,
no, I didn't
that
think it
was
was the key. I thought it was
okay.
the hello world. I thought it was the who am I. I guess the who am I, we should expect just a 4-letter response. So too many bytes. Did we capture the output of the command
That's
and
a great
emit that
point.
into the log or something?
No, I don't think we even. I don't think we did any of this. And also, I have an error here somewhere now. Um, one of these. Oh, this one. So typically, if you want some output, you should get it, in my opinion, and not just expect the code to be written for you. All right. Let's just copy these over. And is anything wrong here? Okay. Okay. So
The
now
format
we
print
should.
line is okay. It doesn't have to get like written to a log instead.
No, yeah, this will be fine.
Okay.
But I'm actually going to surround this with this just for some separation. Might just be easier to identify since I'm running it with the debug flag. Actually, I could just run it without the debug flag, and I think that should be printed.
That's amazing.
All right, let's do one thing. I want to delete it and try it again and see if it still works. That's actually not going to work because we have a finalizer on it and I'm not removing it. But it did reconcile it again, so we see that. So we did it. We're successful.
That's perfect. Ship it.
I also just realized that I have not been checking the chat at all. So I have failed as a live stream host today. But it looks like it was just Jared. Not just Jared. We're very grateful to have you, Jared. You're a very special guest to us. Thank you for joining every episode. And it looks like you responded to him anyway. There's some other viewers on here, but I don't think we got any other comments. So with that, I think we can go ahead and wrap it up. So that was fun. I really enjoyed that. And I think this could be useful. Like I said, there are some like kind of ideas we've been kicking around about things we could do with Packet and potentially other Packet related things where this could be useful. So if you have ideas for that, Marques and I have both tweeted about this show. So feel free to tweet us or respond to one of those or something. And we can also do these like hack episodes, obviously out of the normal cadence of TBS. So as long as I can get Marques to abandon his responsibilities, then we'll get back on and do this again. But Marques, as always, I appreciate you joining us. This was super fun. So yeah, do you have anything you want to share before you close it out today?
Yeah, on Wednesday, I'll be at the Equinix virtual booth of VMworld. So if you're participating at VMworld or if you're not, it's free registration. So sign up and learn some VMware things and stop by the Equinix booth. Awesome. I'm there 11 to 2 Eastern time. I don't know what time that is for everyone else, but Eastern US time.
That's next Wednesday?
Yeah.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, like I said, we'll definitely also have some Crossplane stuff coming out with our new release next week. Specifically excited about some of the stuff around packaging. So if you've installed providers, you've known that one of the things you've seen frequently in the release notes is that you can't update, just by default to new versions. So with the new release, you'll be able to just in place update providers, start the new controllers, bring in new CRDs, that sort of thing. So you can pick up all those nice new types for the different cloud providers and expand your platform offering. So we'll definitely have some shows around that. And we're also going to have a really exciting guest 2 weeks from now on the next episode of TBS. So keep your eyes peeled for the announcement for that. Marques, I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday, and same to all the viewers. And with that, I think we can sign off.
Thanks for watching.